All right. Hello, everybody. Those watching on YouTube, welcome. I'm live on Twitch. I've been essentially streaming all night, and the sun has now come up. So please do cut me some slack, but I will do my best. I have some pretty good news for people. I very carefully looked over the feedback, the incredible constructive criticism, and all of the comments that people left on the first two episodes of the new Speedrun. And I remind you that originally I decided to change the format from longer games, 15 plus 10, in the previous speedrun to the time control, which I did in my original speedrun, which is 5-minute games. And my concept was to play several games per speedrun video and to keep it at kind of a faster pace and to help people develop their instincts. But the majority of the comments, I think, the gist of the comments were that people really feel like they benefit more from the longer time control. I felt like most people feel like the 15 plus 10 games offer more of a relaxed vibe. And I think the crux of the speedrun is that I'm able to explain my reasoning for each and every move. And the longer time control really allows me to do that. So even if some of you were excited about this new format and feel like the faster pace helps you more, I think the majority of people watching, particularly on YouTube, particularly those who are newer to chess, benefit more from the extended time control. And so it was a pretty easy decision to make. I am going back to the 15 plus 10 time control as in the previous speedrun. So this is just going to be another speedrun, another iteration of the same type of speedrun. There are still plenty of concepts to talk about. So it's not like I'm going to be repetitive. We're going to get a whole new set of games, a whole new type of reading climb, and many more fascinating opening discussions and rabbit holes to go into. So I just want to thank everybody for giving me your honest take and your honest feedback. I can't satisfy everybody. So no matter what format I do, some of you might be disappointed. More advanced players might find the first couple of videos to be boring, but I'm doing my best to offer the most instructive value to the most number of people. So thanks once again for your very informative feedback. I've decided to put the 5-minute games aside for now and to start from scratch, doing 15 plus 10 or at most 10-minute games if I've been streaming for a long time and I want to do a shorter episode. But for now, without further ado, let's jump into the pool. Now, my rapid rating is currently at 433. I've lost a couple of rapid games just to stabilize my rating. So the climb is going to be a difficult one. But without further ado, let's jump in. Now, we can call this episode 1. We can call this episode 3. I still hope that you found the first 2 episodes to be somewhat instructive. But I hope that most of you will like this transition back to the slower time control. Okay, here we go. By the way, that took me 5 or 6 takes, that introductory blurb. So I'm pretty happy with the way it turned out. And we are facing, in our very first speedrun game, a London system with Bishop f4. Which is a perfect opportunity for me to showcase a variation that I have played very successfully at my own level, and that I feel really calls into question the London system with move to Bishop f4. Now, those of you who've seen my Blitz games and watched the previous speedrun episodes, you probably know what the move I'm talking about is, and it is c5. We've definitely had speedrun games in the London before. c5, in my opinion, is by far the most challenging move against Bishop f4 and the one that is most unpleasant for London players because it creates basically immediate tactics. It unbalances the position. And if you know the theory well, you're basically fighting for an advantage with black. So d takes c5 is one of several moves that occur very commonly online. The alternatives are d5. There's also e3 and c3. I'll give you kind of a brief overview after the game. But d takes c5 it's a viable move. It's not a very challenging move. And the goal here is for us to win back the pawn on c5. But there are several ways to do that. So you might be rearing to give that check on a5. That might be the first move which comes to your mind. Some of you might want to play this kind of Queen's Gambit style with e6, but both of those moves contain serious drawbacks. The problem with Queen a5 check is that it doesn't develop a piece, right? And it brings the queen out too early in the opening. And once the queen recaptures on c5, yeah, you're going to win the pawn back, but the queen's going to be very vulnerable. The problem with the move e6 is that white is controlling this d6 square, and white can actually stick a bishop on d6, and you're going to have a very hard time winning the pawn back as a result of that. So we need to go for a third option, which is knight to a6. This checks both boxes. It attacks the c5 pawn, 1, and 2, it develops a piece. And after knight takes c5, the knight is going to rejoin the battle. It's going to be nicely placed in the center, and material is going to be equal. We're going to fight for increased control of the center with our d and e pawns. But first, we need to complete step 1, and that means trying to win this pawn. It also stops b4, by the way. It also stops b4. So knight c3, white develops a piece. We obviously recapture on c5, and knight b5, which is a very, very common type of move at this beginner level. White is threatening the fork on c7. Not only would that be a fork, that would actually win our queen, because we would have to give the queen up for the knight. The king has no squares. So there are several ways to disarm this mechanism. There's no reason to panic. The first is, of course, queen a5 check, which, again, if you've watched my speedruns for long enough, you should be well attuned to some of these very basic tactical patterns that I keep reemphasizing. And one of them is that check on a5, which often wins a piece or forces whatever minor piece is on b5. Well, if there's a knight on b5, it often forces it to drop back to its initial square. So that's one way to stop knight c7. The other is to play d6 and to basically intercept the diagonal for the bishop. But I don't see a reason for us not to play queen a5 check, especially because it's pretty embarrassing for white to have to drop the knight all the way back. And newer players particularly don't like retreating moves. And so there's a pretty high probability that white plays a move like queen d2 or c3 or even b4, which would blunder essentially the whole house after queen takes b4 check. Knight c3. So to our opponent's credit, they, as my coach would say sorry and drop the knight back to c3. Now, again, there are several approaches. Many roads lead to Rome. We have a great position and a lead in development. I want to take the most principled approach. This is kind of the vibe of all of my speedruns. I play as though I'm playing a GM. And I don't dumb stuff down just because we're at a certain level. I try to make the best moves and explain them. So what do I see when I look at this position? Well, our strategic priority is ultimately to control the center. So in the name of that, you might think of moves like e6 or even d5 or d6. And all of those moves are very decent. But we've got this brief window of opportunity when white is very underdeveloped. White's entire king side is still on its initial squares. And we have this queen on a5, which on the one hand is a potential vulnerability, but on the other hand, it's pinning the knight on c3. So maybe we can try to use this opportunity and exploit that pin while we still have that opportunity. Now, what does it mean to exploit a pin? Well, in most cases, that means attacking the piece that is pinned, which is the knight on c3. There's no way to attack the knight with a pawn, but there is a way to attack the knight with one of our knights. And there are several good ways to do that. We could play knight a4, or we could play knight f to e4. Now, both of those moves I think are very, very decent. I really like the look of knight to a4 because it also attacks the pawn on b2. And so I'm leaning toward playing knight a4. Yeah, we're going to go knight a4. We're going to go knight a4, which is a very unconventional way of attacking a pinned piece on c3. Most of you are pretty familiar with the idea of jumping into e4, but attacking on the side like this is kind of instructive and pretty unconventional. I'll show you an example of a quick game that I was able to win with a really similar technique after the game. There was nothing wrong with knight e4. So let me get out of the way one very important thing, which is that particularly in the first set of games, we're going to run into situations where there's like 4 or 5 moves and all of them are good and all of them lead to an advantage. And in the vast majority of cases, they're going to be alternatives. All of them are going to be decent. All of them are going to be viable. Now, if you run this position on an engine, maybe you'll find that knight e4 gives a bigger advantage or d5 gives a bigger advantage. That's not the point. The point is that as long as a move keeps a general evaluation, as long as it keeps the advantage, it's a decent move. So if you're watching this and you see me play a move and you're like, well, I wanted to play knight e4 and I thought knight e4 was very strong. It doesn't mean knight e4 isn't strong. It just means I was attracted to a different move for some reason. Bishop to e5. Okay, so this is a very creative defensive move by our opponent. Now, the bishop is connected to the knight, so we definitely don't want to take the knight. If we take the bishop, then white is going to recapture on a4 because the knight will no longer be pinned. And that's a beneficial trade for us. We're going to have the bishop pair. And potentially we could even swing the queen back to a5 and go for part 2. So that's one option. But the other option, remember why we put the knight on a4 and not on e4, the pawn on b2 is hanging. And that's a big pawn because if we capture that pawn, then the knight on c3 loses its supporter and white's entire queenside is liable to collapse. So we just grab the pawn on b2. This is the simplest move. We've already secured some material and white's position is now on the verge of collapse. Everything is starting to hang. This might be a miniature. Queen to d2, which is, of course, a blunder. Now we are free to capture the bishop. Now, if we wanted to be really fancy, right, if we wanted to have Grandmaster level technique, and, well, we do have Grandmaster level technique because I am a GM. At least that's what they told me. What's a better way of winning this bishop? What's a better way of winning the bishop on e5? Yeah, knight to c4. Now, we're not just trying to toy with our opponent, nor is this just semantics. It's good to practice these habits of good technical conversion early on. Yes, queen takes e5 is completely winning, but this is even stronger because it maintains the pin against the knight. The queen is attacked. It has to move. Once the queen moves, we're going to take the bishop with our knight, and we're going to maintain the pin against white's knight on c3. And very likely we're going to win that piece as well. Just a moment. Okay, queen d1, obviously we're going to take. And our opponent resigns. A 9-move game to start the speedrun. We will obviously get another one in and put it in the same video. So I remind you that the arc of this speedrun will resemble the last one in the sense that in the first couple of games, I'm not going to spend 30 minutes giving you a theoretical overview in the opening. I'm going to kind of give you the basics. There is a very high probability that we face the London at least one more time at a higher rating. And so the higher rated we get, the more I'm going to kind of get into the weeds. But in these first couple of games, my goal is to give you sort of the rudiments and the opening basics, if that makes sense. So after c5, white is at a pretty major crossroads. D takes c5 is a decent move. It's not the best move. It's a decent move. The most common move is e3. This is, I think, the move that most books and material on the London system recommend, trying to maintain a stronghold in the center, as is white's entire point in the London system. The move c3, curiously enough, is actually inaccurate, and white is already worse after c3. And this is one of the great appeals of playing the London system with c5. It's that if white makes one misstep, white is very likely going to end up at the very least slightly worse and potentially even lost, which sounds crazy, but is absolutely true. So if white plays c3, I'm going to show you some spicy lines now. Does anybody know what black's best move is in this position? What would you play here? What would you be tempted to play? Very good. Jury Goose got it. The correct move is queen to b6, which is a recurring theme in the c5 variation. The queen comes out to b6, and this move makes a lot of sense because it sounds primitive, but the drawback of the London system is that the b2 pawn is now a weakness, and weaknesses should be attacked as early as possible. So after c3, queen b6, it's actually a very uncomfortable situation for white. Very uncomfortable situation for white. Because white has to defend the b2 pawn. You can't give that pawn away. Everything will collapse. But it's not that easy to defend that pawn conveniently. If you play b3, then you're falling behind in development and you're creating a host of weaknesses on the king side, queen side, that is. Here, we trade on d4. Then we play the move knight to c6. And here's a spicy line for you. If white plays e3, white is already dead lost. Who can tell me, and if you're watching on YouTube, pause the video and see if you can figure out the winning move for black. And yes, the winning move, it's move 6 in a London system, and black is already totally winning. This is a really sexy line, actually. Yes, so you play the move e5, again highlighting the awkwardness of the London bishop. And the point of e5 is that it's a tempo move that gets the bishop out to b4 with check. And white is in huge trouble. Because this pawn is on b3, white does not have the c3 square. So white has to block with knight to d2. Now, I'm not even going to talk about king to e2. You can figure this out yourself. I think after king e2, after king to e2, I'm actually going to double check what the best move is here, just so I don't lie to you. Yeah, the best move here is actually knight takes e5. More tactics. Bishop takes e5. Boom, boom. Queen b5 picks up the bishop. And then the rook in the corner is going to be trapped. So this is a disaster. And after knight d2, you jump into e4 with our knight. Very similar theme to how we won the game. Now, white develops the knight, defending its brother on d2. And here there is a very important winning idea. Once again, pause the video, see if you can figure out the winning approach for black. Another idea that occurs pretty often in these types of tactical lines. It's g5. It's g5 out of nowhere on the king side. You strike with a crazy pawn move, but it's not that crazy when you pause to think about it. Because after bishop takes g5, the simplest approach is just to play bishop takes d2. Now there's a computer move that wins, which is knight takes e5. This is the computer move that wins the game on the spot. And everything collapses here. Absolutely everything. White has to take. Bishop takes d2 check. King to e2. And the simplest way to win is just to fork the king and the queen. Knight c3 takes. You're winning a queen. And you're also going to pick up some of these minor pieces as well. So this is absolutely crushing. If you decline the pawn with bishop g3, now black plays h5. And this is actually a very common trap in several different openings, including the Jobava London, which I have a course on. In the Jobava London, you get something very similar from the white side, where you trap black's bishop in much the same way. So what happens in the Jobava London? Well, oftentimes, let me give you a sample line. Very often, you get a situation like, let me make a couple of very primitive moves. You get a situation like this with white to move. Looks like a completely unremarkable position, but white is in fact already almost winning. Now, the move should already be kind of screaming your name. Same concept, you play g4. Now, bishop e4 is blocked off by the f-pawn, so that's futile. And bishop g6, you play the move h4, threatening to trap the bishop with h5. But the whole point of this is that black has to go h6 or h5. And now and only now do you take the bishop. And look at what happens in this case to black's pawn structure when the f-pawn recaptures the bishop. Now, the e-pawn is a horrible weakness, but in particular, the g-pawn is essentially indefensible. In order to defend it, you have to bring your king out, and that king is going to get massacred along the f-file. Someone was asking, can black take on g4? No, because we have enough defenders on that square. And in much the same way, after c3, let's flip the board again. Queen b6, b3, takes, knight c6, e3, e5, takes, check, knight c2, knight e4, knight f3. Same concept. After g5, white drops back, we play h5, and the moment white plays the h-pawn forward, we take on g3, crippling white's pawn structure entirely, and then e3 is going to fall, and white is completely lost. Completely lost. For example, we can play, let's see. Yeah, we can play queen takes e3 check, queen e2, bishop takes d2 check, knight takes e2, another pawn falls, and then another pawn falls, and white is completely busted. Okay? So I explained already why white can't take on g5. If white takes with the bishop, we have knight takes e5 with a crushing attack on this knight on d2. If white plays knight takes g5, well, obviously, then the knight on d2 falls. Remember that the whole overarching concept here is that the knight on d2 is essentially overloaded. Okay? Bishop g3, you can also play g4 in order to kick the knight. This is also winning. So that's one way for white to lose very quickly. And that's part of the reason that c3 is a very awkward move. After queen b6, white has to play queen b3. This is the best move, but white is still a little bit worse in this line. And you trade on b3, you trade on d4, and now you develop your knight to c6. White's got a lot of these weak pawns. And after e3, there's a very nice maneuver where you go knight to d5, bishop to g3, and now you stick your knight on this lovely outpost on b4. It's threatening a fork. Black has control of a lot of important squares. This is a slight advantage in the endgame. So that's c3. Now, in response to e3, you still play queen to b6. And still, this is a very uncomfortable situation for white. White has to know exactly how to react in this position. Otherwise, again, white's going to be worse. So most people who are new to the London system and see this for the first time, well, obviously they're thinking of moves like b3 or queen c1, which actually just blunders a pawn. Queen c1 blunders a pawn. We can take that one. b3 is almost always a bad idea in the London. If white is forced to make this very weakening move, it generally means that black has succeeded. Our opening strategy has been a success. Sorry, I forgot to take on d4 first. cd4, ed4, and now queen b6. My bad. This is actually the line that I'm recommending. And again, queen c1 blunders the pawn. And if white has to play the move b3, then we simply play d5, and white has a lot of these dark square holes on the queen side. So the best move for white here is actually to play knight c3 and sacrifice the pawn, but this requires a lot of theoretical knowledge. And here my recommendation is to play this very little move a6 to cover the b5 square and reinforce the threat of queen takes b2. Now there's other lines to show, but this is where I'll limit myself for now. We talked about c3. We talked about e3. You trade on d4 and you play queen b6. And this is the basic idea of the move c5. Now you might be wondering what happens if white pushes d5. Here my recommendation is actually to play d6 followed by e5, but this is a whole different kettle of fish, and we'll save this for a more advanced London game. Now let's talk about the game continuation. dc knight a6. Okay. You're going to face this quite a bit if you play c5 with black. And in order to avoid being worse here, white has to play very, very carefully. Now, most intermediate to advanced players with the white pieces here would probably play knight c3, just like our opponent did, but after knight takes c5 would not play the move knight b5. Most intermediate players would probably play knight f3 or e3, but even in this case, white is actually a little bit worse. Even if white plays e3 or white plays a developing move, white is a little bit worse in this position. And the reason, for example, let's say white plays e3. Here, it's important to avoid playing d5. Because if you play d5, now knight b5 is very, very annoying because the bishop is linked up with the knight. Knight c7 is a big threat. And in order to defend that square, we have to kind of contort ourselves, and we don't want to do that. So here, we play the move d6, which should make a lot of sense to you because you're fighting against this bishop on f4, and you're trying to kind of decrease its influence. So we start with the move d6. Let's say that white plays a nonchalant move like knight f3. Now, you might ask, well, what do we do with this bishop? Well, the perfect arrangement for that bishop is, of course, to fianchetto it, just like we would as a King's Indian player. You play g6, and you have a fantastic position. Bishop e2, for example, bishop to g7, castles, and black is doing swimmingly. You've got better pieces. You've got very, very easy play. You can bring this bishop out. You could bring the rook to c8. The queen could still come to b6, and black is in an amazing position. So this is kind of like a dragon on steroids. Now, in order for white to avoid being worse, they have to know this very computerish move f3, which most people are just not going to know. And after f3, knight takes e5, the idea, of course, is to push e4. Once again, our setup remains the same. We play d6, and there's a lot of theory here that you have to know. I won't bore you with it right now, but here you can kind of see the psychological benefit of playing this variation against the London. You're dragging London players into territory that they're not willing to go into. Most London players want something predictable. They want a balanced, quiet position. They don't want something very tactical. And you're immediately forcing the game into more of a tactical channel, which benefits you. Presumably, you like tactics. So after dc knight a6, knight c3 is what you're going to face most of the time. And after knight takes c5, black is already very, very comfortable. Now, our opponent plays kind of a beginner move, knight to b5. And we responded with a check on a5. Again, forcing the knight back to c3. Otherwise, we simply take on b5. And here there is a choice of several very, very good moves. The more conventional approach is to play knight fe4 or even knight c to e4. The engine actually does like the move knight c to e4. And the engine gives a very interesting idea. After knight c to e4, how is white going to defend the knight? Well, likely white is going to drop the bishop back to d2. And here black actually has a fork. There is a double attack that black can make in this position. Let's see who can find it. Black to play and win material. Yeah, queen b6. Suddenly you're threatening a checkmate on f2. You're threatening a scholar's mate. And in order to defend against it, well, white can trade on e4. That doesn't change anything. But in order to defend against it, white has to play e3. And now, for example, you can trade the knight for the bishop, and you can grab b2, and you have everything. You have an extra pawn. Potentially, you could take another one. And you have the bishop pair, and white's position is completely in shambles. So knight to e4 would have been extremely strong. Knight c to e4 would have been extremely strong. We decided to play knight to a4, going the other way. Probably the last chance for white to stay in the game would have been to play queen to d2. And in this position, if we take on b2, maybe white can play e4 and cover the c4 square, but still, white's position is very, very suspicious. Not to mention that we could just take on c3 here and ruin white's pawn structure. So I'm belaboring the point here. Our opponent played bishop e5, which is a creative move, but loses the game due to knight takes b2, and everything falls apart here. Now, the last thing I'll mention is what would have been our response to the move queen to d4? What would have been our response to queen to d4? What is the fastest way for black to win the game here? See if you can understand what it is. And it's not what you probably think it is. So it's not knight e4. That's a blunder because white can play queen takes e4. Remember, the bishop defends the knight. Now, I think a lot of you probably think, oh, let's go d6 and let's chase this bishop out of the way. But here white can buy themselves some time with bishop takes f6. So the correct move here is actually to play e6 in order to open up the dark squared bishop. And the takeaway here is that when you sense that you're very close to winning the game right out of the opening, the missing ingredient is often just to involve as many pieces as possible. It's not necessarily to make the tempo moves, but it's rather to involve pieces as quickly as possible. So e6 is super strong. Why is it so strong? Let's say that white plays, I don't know, knight f3. Okay? Now you play bishop to c5. And the queen simply has nowhere to go. If white drops back to d2, you drop back to c4, and white is just collapsing on all cylinders here. That's not an expression. Queen to d3, knight e5, knight e5, and now bishop to b4, attacking both of the knights at the same time. The queen has no other good squares. If the queen goes to the side of the board, so knight f3, bishop c5, queen to h4, then I'm going to double check this, but I think, yeah, I mean, even bishop b4 is just totally crushing. White has to come back to d4, and now knight to d5, just completely piling up on this knight, and white has no way to defend it. White is losing a piece. Yeah, I've coined a new expression. Anyways, you get the point. In the game, our opponent blundered the bishop on e5. The way that we took it, though, deserves some attention. We took it in a way that keeps the queen on a5 and keeps this other knight pinned. White is completely busted here. Now, I wanted to show you a quick game before we move on. And I know this was kind of a long explanation, but hopefully this is what most people want. All right, so take a look at this game. This is one of the shortest tournament games that I ever played, that I ever won. And my opponent was not actually that bad. He was 1750. This was 2007. And look how similar this game turns out. So e4, c5, knight f3, d6, bishop e2. I'm like, okay, well, that's not really a move. So I played knight f6, knight c3, g6. I'm kind of going for the dragon setup. Rook to b1. I'm like, all right, not sure what my opponent is doing. I'm just going to keep developing. And he goes b4. Like, okay, I guess that makes sense. So I traded and I castled. I'm just continuing to develop. And when he plays d4, I'm like, okay, now I need to start thinking about scoring a quick victory because he's not castling. The knight on c3, just like in our speedrun game, is totally unprotected. And the rook on b4 is very vulnerable. There's a reason you're not supposed to bring your rook out like this in the opening. Black to play and win the game immediately. Queen a5. I mean, this is just begging to be played. My opponent is like, no, I'm not going to get that rook out. I'm like, yes, you are. Knight to c6. The rook has nowhere to go. If it goes back to b3, then knight takes c4 and white collapses. So my opponent tries to muddy the waters with e5. I traded on e5, and now I take on b4. And even though both knights are hanging, white can only capture one of them at the same time. So if white captures this knight, and we recapture on b4, white captures the other knight, we capture one of white's knights with check and come back to take the pawn. We're up in exchange in 2 pawns. This is pretty easy to calculate. My opponent took the other knight. I take back. Same deal. We're attacking this knight with check. My opponent played bishop to b2, and the final move of the game is really, really funny. There's actually 2 ways to win the game. Both of these moves are totally equivalent. They do the same thing, but I played the more aesthetically pleasing one. Yeah, knight a2. The other move was knight to d5. But I played knight a2, and he resigned because the knight on c3 is completely surrounded. And white's going to be a full rook down after I win the knight. So for a 1750, white played terribly, but I think you can kind of see the point, which is that anytime the knight on c3 is undefended like that and the king is uncastled, you need to be aware of the power of the early attack on the queen side by your queen, either from b6 or from a5 or from both. So hopefully that kind of illustrates the point. All right, and we have white against the 692. Let's play e4. And e5, we're going to play the Gleck system. That is going to be our main opening for this entire speedrun. Now, remember that early on, most people don't actually play into the 4 knights. A lot of people, they go d6 or they develop the bishop first. So we're going to face a lot of like philidors and a lot of sidelines before we even get a chance to go into the Gleck system. There we go, right? So d6 is a very, very common move for whatever reason at these beginner levels. And essentially, the formula for responding to d6 in any position is largely the same. D6 is a passive move because it blocks in the bishop, it doesn't develop a piece, and the algorithm for dealing with that involves, first and foremost, opening up the center. So most of you know that the automatic response to this move is d4. d4 is a great move, trying to initiate a series of trades in the center that are going to allow us to exploit our lead in development and our superior piece placement. So d4 is pretty easy. If you're a beginner, you just have to count the attackers and defenders. We have 1 defender on that square, but black has only 1 attacker. So in the event of a trade, our queen is going to end up on d4. And after the trade, we have this situation, very instructive situation. Now at a beginner level, c5 is very common and queen f6 is very common. These 2 moves are incredibly common at these lower levels because, well, newer players, they like to attack pieces. Our opponent takes the developmental approach. That's a mature move. But after the game, I'll kind of quickly talk about how to meet, moves like c5 and queen f6 in these philidor type positions. Okay, so knight f6. Now we have many ways in which we can continue our development. Let's think about where our bishops belong. Well, generally, we want to choose the most active square for our bishops, and that doesn't necessarily mean the most advanced square. It doesn't mean that you take your bishop and you put it on the last square of the diagonal. Well, that would be just plain bad because that would be bishop h6. Now, in many cases, yes, putting a bishop on your opponent's side of the board is a good strategy, but that's not necessarily because it's an advanced move. It's just because it actually does something. So in this case, bishop to g5 is excellent because it pins the knight and it starts to put pressure on black's position. And that's the move that we're going to start with. But on the other hand, bishop to b5, that's okay. Yes, it's a tempo move, but it just runs into c6. And why would we allow black to block the check with tempo? There's no reason to give the check on b5. Instead, there's several good squares for this bishop. I really like c4. C4 is just generally a good square for the light squared bishop because it pressures f7, which is the weakest pawn on the board. You could also play bishop to d3. And this is a more advanced move, paradoxically enough, because I think to newer players, the move bishop d3 may seem very lame. Like, why are you putting the bishop on a square where it just like stares into the pawn? And bishop d3 is a move that prepares a more long-term attack. And in fact, I think I'm going to do it. I think I'm going to play bishop d3, and I'm going to attempt to illustrate through the lens of this game how a move might not seem, particularly active at the moment, but once the position opens up, you often start to appreciate the virtues of a piece like this. Okay, so c5. I told you at some point this move always comes. And why do we not fear the move c5? Well, to answer that question, we need to understand what its drawbacks are. There are 2 main drawbacks of the move c5. The first is that it creates a potential outpost on d5. This is now a major weak square. I've talked about this at great length in previous speedrun games. The second is that, as often accompanies a weak square, there is a backward pawn. There's a backward pawn on d6, which is eminently attackable because it's a backward pawn on an open file, which means that we could very easily use our heavy pieces to put pressure on that pawn. So we need to answer the immediate question: where are we moving the queen? Where are we going? There's many ways that we could do this. This simple move is queen to e3. Most of you are probably thinking about queen to e3, but there's a more clever way to play this position. There's a much more clever way to play this position. It's not queen to c4. I don't like that move at all because you're running into a developing move with tempo. But I'm thinking about something a little bit deeper than that. Yeah, I'm thinking about this intermediate check on b5 with the bishop to b5 check. And this is a pretty deep move, right? We're still at the beginner level. I try to avoid complicated concepts at this level, but my philosophy is kind of changing as I'm moving forward. And at this point, I just, I want to play the way that I would play against a GM. And I feel like if I do a sufficiently good job of breaking down the concepts, then even newer players will be able to understand my logic. So I'm giving this check on b5. Why am I doing that? Black blocks with bishop d7. Okay, there's a potential trade of bishops. How do I know that trade benefits me? Well, at a positional level, the reason the trade of light squared bishops benefits white has to do with the fact that the d5 square is weak. If we're able to eliminate the light squared bishop, then black essentially has no pieces that can guard this outpost on d5. The only piece that's going to be guarding that outpost is the knight on f6, and we can capture that knight whenever we want to. So in the long run, we are clearing the obstacles for occupying the d5 pawn. In addition to that, we are leaving black with a very lame dark squared bishop, which is tied down to protecting this very lame backward pawn on t6. So we're simply removing black's only active piece. Black's only active piece is that light squared bishop. By trading it off, we are leaving black with just a set of extremely lame minor pieces. So the simplest option here is just to trade on d7. Now, if black takes on d7 with the knight, that opens up the path to the g7 pawn. And after queen takes g7, we're hitting the rook on h8. So the tactics work out for us. Okay, here we go. Queen takes d7. So now we need to figure out a good square for our queen. How am I approaching this? Well, we know that our big goals in this position are to attack the pawn on d6 and potentially to keep d5 under control. But d5 is already under control. We're already controlling this outpost. We don't need to actively take steps to maintain our control over it. There's a lot of good squares for the queen. I like dropping it back to d3. I like moving it to the side. Queen to c4 is a great move. Let me think about this for a second. This decision is not particularly important. There's a lot of good squares. We're going to drop it back to d3. Yeah, queen to d2 is also fine. It really doesn't matter that much. Queen d3 is fine. The reason I chose queen d3 over queen to d2 is because the queen has more lateral mobility here. Again, this is not necessary, but in the future, let's say that black castles kingside, we might have this move queen to g3 in our pocket, which would potentially x-ray the king along the g file. So on d3, the queen has mobility both lateral and as well as vertical. I'm assuming that our opponent is going to castle kingside. Maybe our opponent castles queenside. Yeah, also we're covering a lot of these light squares, so we're preventing black from advancing the pawn to b5. Yeah, our opponent is playing very, very decently for their level. This is a situation, if you're watching this, you really, really should pay careful attention to how I'm playing this, because this is really a very common situation at the beginner to intermediate level where you have this weak square on d5. Maybe some of you are watching this and you're saying, yeah, I get this a lot, where you get some sort of a philidor and then there's a queen on d4 and then your opponent plays c5. So, try to watch how I handle this, and it's going to be impossible to emulate it move for move, but you should try to understand the concept. So the next decision that we have to make is obviously where we're going to castle. And again, our position is so dominant strategically that both long castle and short castle are perfectly viable options. And it by and large depends on your mood. If you're in a very aggressive mood and you want to try to end the game quickly, then I like castling queenside. If you're in a Russian schoolboy mood, castling kingside is the slightly safer option. In the name of attacking the d6 pawn as efficiently as possible, I like castling queenside. For the obvious reason that it also brings a rook in onto d1. Now we've got two heavy pieces that are piled up on d6. Now, am I afraid of potential repercussions on this side of the board? No. And that's part of the reason I put my queen on d3. Black can't get the engine started at all. Like b5, we can just take that pawn if we want to. c4, that doesn't do anything. Black doesn't have anything resembling an attack on the queen side. There's nothing to be afraid of here. Now, I'm moving toward making a very important point, but let's wait for Black's move. Rook fd8. Black is actually playing this very reasonably. Okay, so the point that you have to keep in mind is that when you're conducting sort of a positional game like this, a lot of people get too invested in achieving the narrow goal. And so in this position, a lot of people would be tempted to exchange on f6 and then plant a knight on d5. And that is a pretty reasonable option, but it's definitely not the best that we can do. And the simplest way to explain that is, well, we're not really in a hurry to capture this knight. We can do that whenever we want to, and we can actually aim for a lot more than just a good knight versus bad bishop. If you look at this position tactically, we're actually very, very close to just breaking through in the center. And a lot of you are actually pointing out the move e5 here, which is really interesting. It attacks the knight, and if Black takes on e5, they drop a piece because we trade queens, and eventually the bishop on e7 is going to be picked up by our bishop. But after e5, I think there's this annoying knight jump to g4, and that leads to some complications. Are they in our favor? Yeah, they probably are. Let's go e5. I'm just thinking about this for a second. Do we want to cash in our chips? There's no reason for us to rush with e5. There's no reason for us to rush with e5. We can take our time. Right? And this is one of the hardest things to do. You see a move that looks good, but you're not totally sure about it. Take your time, build up the advantage. A cleaner opportunity will always come if you make healthy moves. So how can we improve our position? What does it even mean to improve your position here? Well, there's many things that you can do to improve your position in a substantive way. First of all, there's a rook on h1. We could bring it into the center. Rook h1 is an easy move that you could make. Easy way for us to improve our position. Why not? Let's start with rook h1. Many other things that you could do. King to b1, nothing wrong with that move, although it's a little bit on the slower side. Or you could play with your pawns, f4, another move that could be considered. Queen to g4. Okay, so this move is a lot scarier, a lot less scary than it looks, but it is a pretty good move. I have to compliment our opponent for their play. So let's think about how we can deal with this move. Now, technically, this forks the bishop and the pawn on g2, technically. And we're going to have to rely on some tactics in order to disarm this, which I was hoping to avoid. But unfortunately, there's just nothing that we can do. We have to play a little bit tactically here to get the better of our opponent for in response to this move. And there's several things that we could do in response. Again, I wouldn't rush to take on f6 and stick a knight on d5 because we're cashing in our chips too quickly. The key thing to understand here is that queen takes g2 itself is not a dangerous move. And even without calculating a single variation, I can tell you for a fact that if Black takes this pawn on g2, they're going to be massacred on the king side. Very likely, we're also going to trap the queen, but at the very least, we're going to just checkmate Black very straightforwardly on the king side. And to demonstrate that, I'm going to offer this g2 pawn as a sacrifice. But there's another threat. The bishop on g5 is hanging. Should we move it? Well, we don't have anywhere good to move it because h4 and f4 are both controlled by the queen, and I don't really want to bring the bishop back to e3. So can we defend it? Well, we can defend it. Can we do it with a pawn? We can do it with a pawn. Let's go f4. We're protecting the bishop, and we're sacrificing the pawn on g2. Now, our opponent is probably contemplating whether or not to grab this pawn on g2 and think, is this pawn poisoned? Is this guy bluffing us? Well, sneak preview, I'm not bluffing, but queen takes g2 is not going to end well for Black. Yeah, h6. I know a lot of you are like, well, what about h6? Aren't we compelled to trade on f6? Then the answer is no. We are not compelled to trade, but I'm happy to see queen takes g2 because this gives me a chance to demonstrate the punishment. So the instinct move after queen takes g2, and this is true on both sides of the board. You'll see this often on the other side with queen takes b2. When a pawn is captured, a file is opened. There's a king on the g file, so there's a move which is very obvious. It doesn't take a lot of calculation to see it. It's not e5. That is a blunder. Black plays d takes e5. It's rook to g1. It's rook to g1. We simply put a rook on the file that has just been opened up by the black queen. While we do that, we attack the queen, and the queen doesn't have a lot of good squares. And we are obviously setting up the potential for a devastating attack against black's king. And we're sacrificing another pawn while we're doing it. We're sacrificing a pawn on h2. Yes, that is true. Okay, so our opponent is obviously contemplating how to keep this queen alive, which is no easy feat because the queen is almost out of squares. Notice that the third rank is protected. So black literally has two possible moves. There's queen f2 and queen takes h2. And in response to both of those moves, we can continue pursuing the queen with our rooks. So if queen takes h2, we can consider the move rook to h1, which is what we're going to play. Yeah, queen takes h2 on the board. Now we're going to play another tempo move, rook to h1. Same concept. We're moving the rook to the file that has just been opened up by the enemy queen. Let's see where the queen escapes to. Very likely, now we're going to try to win this game in one of two ways. Either it's going to be a direct checkmating attack against the black queen, the black king, or we're going to try to trap this queen. It's going to be one of two different conclusions to the game. Okay, so the first order of business in these types of situations is to see whether you can trap the queen, right? To see how many escape squares the queen has and whether you can simply trap the queen. Because if you can, that solves all of your problems. Then it's very easy. So can we play the move rook to d2 or rook to f1? Does that trap the queen? So let's consider the move rook to d2. And we're going to have to do some calculation here. That's inevitable. That's just the nature of chess. So rook to d2 does not trap the queen. The queen does have this retreating square to d4. Rook d2, queen d4. And if we play queen takes d4, well, that's just a queen trade. Remember, we've sacrificed two pawns. We don't just want like some pawn down endgame. That's awful. So I'm just actually thinking what the cleanest win is. Just a moment. I'm trying to see if I can find a very, very clean win. Okay, just a moment. Okay. So rook d2, queen to d4 is a little bit messy. Hopefully, we're all on the same page there. So here's a hypothetical. If the d4 square was controlled, then rook to d2 would trap the queen, right? But the d4 square, what does it mean to control a square in the context of trapping a queen? It basically means to control a square with anything except your own queen, right? So notice the rook on d1. You don't actually need to play a move like knight b5. You already have the ingredients right there. The rook on d1 is already controlling the d4 square. All that it requires is getting this damn queen out of the way. But when you get a piece out of the way, you want that piece to also be working for you. You don't just want to put it on some old random square. How do we get our queen to work for us? Well, remember, we have this new open file. We have the H file. Why don't we double up on the H file? And why don't we create a secondary threat of finally eliminating this knight and infiltrating with our queen, very likely with a mating attack? Queen h3 is a classy move. And it just creates unstoppable threats, both against the king and against the queen. Now we're threatening rook d2, trapping the queen. And there's just nothing that black can do. Yeah. I will explain the other move order. By the way, the other move order was also winning, I think. So a lot of you are like, wait a second, what about rook d2, queen d4, and then queen h3? Well, first of all, that doesn't trap the queen. It lets the queen off the hook. So then you would be reliant on the second method of winning, which is like a direct mating attack. And I want to minimize the risk. So here we keep both of our options open. We're threatening to trap the queen, and we're threatening to launch this mating attack against black's king. Yeah, so notice that if black plays h6 and we play rook to d2, you might, well, what is black getting for the queen? Well, black can get a rook for the queen, right? Queen takes rook, king takes queen. But black is actually not getting this bishop because queen h8 is going to be checkmate. No difference. A rook h2, rook d2, both of these are essentially equivalent threats. Even rook f1 traps the queen. Even rook df1 traps the queen. So we're threatening 4 different ways of trapping the queen. Yeah, I mean, I would say if you're watching on YouTube, don't worry too much about our opponent's rating. The strength is going to fluctuate. Everybody knows that, below 1,000, you're going to get some players who blunder all their pieces. You're going to get others who play very competently, and it's just a mixed bag. Okay, because it's a lot of people who are provisional, and you just don't know. So, don't worry too much about how well or how badly our opponent is playing. Just focus on playing your best chess. Yeah, so we're 17 moves in. Our opponent is obviously slowing down. I think they're realizing the extent of the problems. Black is completely lost. H6 is on the board, and without any kind of thinking, maybe bishop takes H6 leads to checkmate, right? But chess is above all a practical game. Your goal is to win the game. It's not to play perfectly. It's to win the game. If you see a way to win the queen, just do it. Rook to d2, over. That's it. Queen is lost. And then, of course, we can converge on the black king. It's not like our attack is over once we win the queen. Quite the opposite. Our attack is only beginning. Yeah, c4, by the way, would have extricated the queen. Kudos to anybody who spotted this resource, c4, right? Opening up this diagonal escape for the black queen. And after the game, I'll show you there's at least like 2 or 3 ways that we can win very straightforwardly after c4. Yeah, I'll talk about c4 after the game. Yeah, rook to d2. I'm expecting our opponent to either resign or to give up the queen for the rook. Okay, so this is kind of the slight downside of this time control. Our opponent is going to spend their good old time thinking about contemplating the hopelessness of their situation. Okay, queen to e3. Well, that is a deflection sacrifice. It deflects our queen from the h file. Now they resign with their conscience fully clear. Okay, time for a little bit of an analysis, and then we will conclude the stream and the video. So let's start from the beginning. Knight f3. Now remember that the traditional Philidor is d6, and in this position I have recommended to start with bishop c4. I really like this move. And to delay d4 for a couple of moves. But knight c6, knight c3, d6 is a slightly different version of the Philidor, and here I do like the move d4. You've probably already had this in a speedrun game. Now, some of you were wondering what happens after bishop to g4. And here it's important to remember this resource. We actually pin black's knight in response, bishop to b5. Because I think a lot of people, when faced with a situation like this, they think that the only 2 options are either to close the center with d5. And we don't want to close the center. We have the lead in development. We have more space. And the other option is to play d takes e5. You might say, like, well, this opens up the center. It's a good move. But yes, it opens up the center, but at the cost of potentially trading queens, which we also don't want. We don't want to trade queens. So the best move here is actually bishop to b5. And the point is that if black takes the knight with the bishop, we take with a pawn. We play g takes f3, e takes d4, queen takes d4, or even we can start by taking the knight on c6 and then play queen takes d4. And this position is really, really good for white. Why is it really good for white? Well, let's say that black develops the knight to f6. Now, a really powerful move involves sliding the queen over to c4 and attacking this weak c6 pawn. Really, the only viable move is queen d7. Now the bishop is brought out to g5. Again, the only viable move is bishop e7. Now, of course, we castle queenside, and black is nowhere safe to castle. Well, I'm not even going to talk about castles queenside. This is suicidal. If black castles kingside, then the benefit of g takes f3 is revealed. And this is why I always say that pawn structure is overrated, right? It's not overrated in the grand scheme of things. It's just that when you play a move like g takes f3, you should focus not only on the drawbacks of the structure, but also on the benefit, which is that the g file is now at your disposal anytime the black castles kingside. So after all of this happens, castles kingside, you play rook h to g1, and you have this massive attack down the g file that black has to reckon with for the rest of the game. And after king to h8, I think the only reasonable move. A lot of good ways for us to continue here. We can play f4 and e5, crash through in the center. We can double rooks on the g file. We can drop the bishop back and open up a more direct line of fire to the g7 pawn. The b file is not the same because black's pieces are much more passive, And so black is not able to use the B file in the same way that we use the G file, right? You can't look at this and say, well, the position is equal because both of us have this semi-open file. Compare the placement of the pieces. Just look at the pieces. We have the pin against the queen. We have black tied down to the C6 pawn. The bishop on E7 is terrible. Our bishop is amazing. It can do a bunch of different things. We have a lot more mobility with our pawns. We can play F4 and then E5, and black can't really do the same thing. D5 is never really possible because we have that square under control. Okay, so even very early on in your chess development, remember that a position evaluation is based on identifiable factors. One of them is king safety. Pawn structure is important, but particularly important is the placement of the pieces, right? Who has the more active pieces overall? Okay, so bishop G4, we respond with bishop to B5. That's kind of point number one. So in the game, black trades everything on D4. And I just wanted to briefly mention how I would have responded to the move queen to F6, which is a very, very common type of move that you see at the beginner level. Many ways that we could respond. The one thing that you shouldn't do, you should not trade queens here for pretty obvious reasons. When you trade queens, the impact of a development advantage, the impact of a space advantage is greatly decreased. You're not able to attack as easily. So definitely no queen takes F6. So we want a good square for our queen, many good squares for our queen. We can drop it back to D3. We can deliver a check on A4. That's actually a great move. And then slide the queen back to B3. This is the best square on the board for the white queen because it's like the commander in this position. It's attacking B7, it's pressuring F7, and black is in huge trouble here. Huge trouble. Because this pawn on B7 needs to be protected. How do you defend it? If you play, I don't know, bishop to C6, then we could just develop the bishop to E3, then we could castle queenside. And black's pieces are also not getting out easily on the king side. That's why it's so bad to have a queen on F6. Not only is it vulnerable, but you're going to run into a situation like this where the pieces are like stumbling over each other, whereas white is just beautifully, harmoniously developing. Okay. So this is just one of several ways that we can play a queen A4 and queen B3. In the game, we had knight F6, bishop G5, bishop B7, bishop D3. And hopefully, okay, I never was able to explain exactly why I put my bishop on D3, but what I was hoping would happen in the game, I was hoping that our opponent would castle, and then we would castle queenside. And let's make a random move, like, I don't know, A6. It's important to recognize that the bishop on D3, first of all, is fulfilling an important defensive role. It's reinforcing the pawn on E4, but it's also got a lot of potential energy. And potential energy is how I refer to a piece's potential. Even if it's staring at a pawn one given moment, that pawn can move out of the way, and that piece could potentially be the game-winning piece. So even in this position, white has a very interesting combination that I think comes very close to winning the game. Does anybody see what I'm saying? Yes. So you can start with E5, and I'm not claiming that this is the best move. I'm just showing you an example of what I'm trying to say. And now the queen slides over to H4, and suddenly this bishop is the hero of white's position. What are we threatening? Well, first of all, we're threatening the discovery against black's queen. Second of all, we're threatening to remove the defender and to checkmate black on H7. So bishops like this on D3 are very venomous. And even if you don't end up playing E5, this bishop is out of the way of the other pieces. There's nothing wrong with putting a piece on a more modest square where it fulfills a more defensive role. This is just something that you should kind of chew on, particularly if you're newer to chess. You don't always have to try to maximize the activity of every single piece. There's kind of a balance involved. So we played bishop D3, our opponent played C5, and immediately we jumped with the bishop to B5. And I kind of explained this move during the game. But once again, if we can force black to play king F8, then this move has been a success. And then we can drop our queen back to D2 or D3 or whatever. Knight D7 is never possible because we take on G7 and the rook is hanging. And after bishop D7, we have effectuated a very favorable trade of bishops, which now allows us to focus on attacking the D6 pawn and really highlights the futility of this bishop on E7. Okay, so castles, castles. We go queenside. and rook h to d8. And here I want to illustrate one important point about tunnel vision and keeping things in perspective. I want to show you a game that I lost many years ago. And this game taught me a very valuable lesson. I was 1600 when this game was played. Yes, I was once 1600. Quite a long time ago, although depending on what your perspective is. Okay, so I think you can kind of spot some similarities between this position and the position that we had in the game. This comes from a Scotch, and we also have opposite side castling. I've built up this very impressive kind of attacking formation on the king side. And here my opponent plays the move c5. Okay, so what would you do in this position with white? What would you do with white here? Pause the video and just kind of ask yourself, what is your instinct in this position? I'm actually going to turn on Stockfish just to make sure that I'm not lying to you. I vividly remember that when this game was being played, I was under the impression that I was very close to winning the game. I was under the impression that my attack was about to crash through and that c5 was essentially desperation. And so I was like, well, what's the drawback of the move c5? Well, it weakens the d6 pawn. So I was like, let's start collecting the material. And I played a sequence of moves that my coach yelled at me for. I played bishop takes f6, bishop takes f6, and as you can probably imagine, I grabbed the pawn on d6. And I lost this game in another 10 moves, although essentially the game is lost already on the next move. What is Black's response to queen takes d6? It's queen to a5. Yeah. And the game is over. Just look at this position from a developmental standpoint. Black's bishops are monsters. The queen on d6 is about to be massacred by the rook. Nothing is going out. Black is blockading all of these key dark squares. I suddenly realized that I literally have no moves. Black is about to take on a2. My king is going to get checkmated. And so I started throwing away material, but it didn't help. Black crashed through on a2, took another pawn, and then took my knight, and I resigned. So that was very 1600 of me. So the reality is after c5, white is already much worse, and desperate measures are required in order to stay in the game. Now, the 2600 me would probably go bishop e3, although the situation is still very, very tough after queen to a5 because there's no good way of defending the a2 pawn. Maybe you can play the move a3 here and try to defend it tactically. The secondary option would have been to take on f6 and then play the move king to b1. This is probably the best way to try to disarm Black's attack. King to b1. And if queen a5, you now have this very nice, nifty defensive move, knight c1. And you're guarding the a2 pawn, and you're still all right. Now you can continue attacking. But the point that I'm trying to make is that sometimes when you tunnel vision the goal, you kind of forget to put things in context. And this is one of the reasons why I was so adamantly emphasizing that we should not kind of automatically grab the knight on f6 at the first chance we get. I see this all the time. Let's say Black would have played h6. Now, what's your move in this position? Your instinct should be to play a move like bishop f4 or bishop to h4. Your instinct should not be to play bishop takes f6, and queen takes d6. Now, in this case, white is still probably better in this position, but this is not the best that you can do. Even if Black responds in the most primitive way imaginable, trade the queens, trade the bishop for the knight, is white really, are you really satisfied with this endgame? You're a pawn up, yes, congrats, but you have bad structure on the queen side. It's a rook endgame. You know that rook endgames can be very hard to win. But clearly, this is not the best that you can do in this position. And so there's this weird paradox that exists in chess, which is that, our entire play is centered around this weak pawn on d6 and this weak square on d5, but that doesn't mean that we will abandon all of our other ambitions and that we will make major sacrifices in order to secure this pawn or secure the square. We can always play bishop takes f6. That move is not going anywhere. So instead, we're trying to go for maximum here with f4 and e5, or by centralizing our pieces first and only when the moment is right to cash in our chips. So don't rush to cash in your chips, especially in a situation like this. All right. Rook fd8, rook h1, very patient move, queen g4, f4. I think I explained this move pretty thoroughly. And a lot of you were wondering, how would we avoid trading the bishop for the knight after h6? And the move that many of you were missing is h3. This is the move that I was relying on to save this bishop, h3. And if black plays queen takes g2, then this is a worse version of the game, because after rook g1, we can actually take on h6 on the next move. If the queen moves back to h5, then we continue chasing it with g4. It's forced to abandon the h4 square, and now we just safely drop our bishop back. And if the queen moves back, then we simply can play bishop h4, maintaining all of the virtues of our position. And then we can continue kind of accumulating the pressure with g4. Yeah, but after queen takes g2, we play the move rook to g1. This should always be your instinct when a pawn is captured on the g or b file. And after queen takes h2, I think probably here was the most difficult moment of the game. This and the next move. Because I think a lot of people here would probably be very fixated on the g file, and you would be trying to make a move like bishop h6 work. Well, bishop h6 doesn't work because that square is controlled. Some of you were angling for e5, but that's just not a move which should really be on your radar as long as the queen is on d3, because d takes e5 is a discovered attack against the white queen. This is very inconvenient. So how do you see a move like rook h1? What was the impetus behind this move? Well, okay, this was pretty much an instinctive reaction. But what I noticed is that this h7 pawn is actually the weakest pawn on the board for black, because our queen is aiming at it diagonally, our rook is aiming at it, and this is the pawn which we need to capture in order to initiate the mating attack. So rook h1 should make sense to you. Queen to f2. If black would have played queen to g2, we would have probably played rook to d to g1, and this would have been very, very similar to the game. Queen f2, queen h3, and yeah, this is completely decisive. So queen f2, queen h3. Again, I explained this move during the game. Last thing I'll mention, what would we have done after c4? c4, I think, is the only way for black to save the queen, because it opens up this diagonal escape. We have a million ways to win the game with white. I think the absolute simplest, what is the variation which requires the least calculation? It's probably bishop takes f6, honestly. Finally, I think it's time for us to trade that bishop for the knight. Now, black can take this pawn on f4. We do not give a you-know-what about that. In fact, we kind of want black to take on f4. That doesn't change anything. We just slide our king to b1. Now, black has to take on f6 with the bishop, right? This should be very clear to you, because otherwise the king is going to be mated on f8. If black takes on f4, the reason that helps us is because here we can actually jump our knight into d5, and queen h8 is a mate threat. The f4 queen is hanging. So that makes things even worse for black. Bishop takes f6 is a more clever move, but it doesn't change the substance. We can do the same thing. Queen takes h7, king f8. Now, among other things, we can jump the knight into d5. And this is a very classic technique, right? You take away the escape square. In so doing, you're also centralizing your knight. So it's a helpful move. And black is just completely busted. Black is checkmated. Let's say that the king continues to run. Now, I think the mating sequence is check, queen takes f7 check. If king c8, then we mate the king on the queen side. If king to c6, then check takes. And I'll let you figure out the rest. I mean, remember that we haven't even sacrificed anything. We're actually up a pawn at this point. So there's really nothing at stake. So the rule of thumb really in these situations should be you want to try to win without sacrificing unnecessary material, 1. And 2, you want to remember that there's a very clear formula for king hunts. The first line of defense for you should be to take away the initial escape route. So already in this situation, you should be trying to figure out how the king is going to escape from the king side. And so as a result, you should be like, well, clearly the only escape route is through f8 and e7. And so the move knight to d5 should kind of come to mind as a way of taking away that very important escape square on e7. Okay, so this would be one of a million ways for us to win the game. I will leave it to you to find some of the others. Probably we could start with a move like rook to d2 or rook to f1. The position is completely and utterly and totally winning. You could also probably go e5 and just directly attack this knight with a pawn. And that's that. h6, rook d2, we win the queen. Last thing I mentioned, of course, is that the bishop is still untouchable because we would mate on h8. And if black would have done this and then would have like escaped to f8, we could sack on h6, but I probably would have just dropped the bishop back to h4 and we would have easily converted our extra queen. So I have a lot more to say on the topic of punishing black for the move c5, because this scenario is extremely common at this level, but I think that's probably enough for one game. Hopefully you were able to get a little bit more clarity on how to play against this structure. Now, obviously, situations differ from game to game. So you might have a situation where black has a pawn on a6. You might have this situation. You might say, well, Daniel played bishop b5 check. I don't have that move. Do I panic? No, you have to adapt. So in this situation, you would just have to drop your queen back to e3. Every situation is different. Don't try to apply it move for move. Try to take away the more general concepts. But hopefully you enjoyed the 15-minute speedrun, folks. Thanks again, everybody, for providing your honest feedback. From now on, we will be switched back to this longer time control. And I'll be doing more episodes in the next couple of days. Thanks, everybody, for watching. It's time for me to go to sleep. I am exhausted. This turned into an all-nighter stream. Have a good one. See you guys later.